All right, so at this point we've seen how to implement two popular design patterns in TypeScript. So now we're going to close out by taking a look at one last design pattern called the command pattern and how we can implement that using TypeScript. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start off by creating a new file called command.ts that we'll be writing our example code inside of. And the main idea of the command pattern is that any change that takes place in our program should be able to be represented as its own class. All right, so let's just jump in here and see what this pattern is going to look like in code, because that'll probably help us understand how it works a little bit better. So the first thing that we're going to do here is we're going to add an interface called command, and that'll look like this. We'll just say interface command. And in the command pattern, there's really only one main method that this interface requires its implementers to have, and that's a method called execute, right? And basically what this execute method does is it will make some sort of change in the program, and it's usually going to return void. Now, as a matter of fact, there is another method that's often seen in the command pattern, and that is a method called undo. Now, the idea with this method is that it will basically do the opposite of whatever the corresponding execute method does. All right, so now that we have this command interface, the example that we're going to use to demonstrate this is the example of a simple counter class that keeps track of how many times an element or a value has been incremented. So let's just create that class real quick. We'll say class counter, and this isn't going to implement the command interface. That's going to happen somewhere else, as you'll see. And then what we're going to do is we're going to give it an instance variable called value, and that's going to be a number, and it will start off with the value 0. All right, so this counter class now is going to have a simple method which we'll call setValue. And what this will do is it will basically take a new value and it will set the value instance variable to this new value. So let's actually call that argument new value. That's going to be a number, of course. And we'll say this.value equals new value. All right, so now that we have this counter class, let's create a class that implements this command interface that will allow us to increment this counter one by one. So what that's going to look like is we're going to say class increment command. All right. And what this class is going to do, oops, I didn't mean to add the curly braces there. We're going to say implements command. And this, of course, needs to have both the execute and undo commands from before. So let's just add those. We're going to say execute, and we'll also have undo. And another thing that we're going to need to do here with this increment command is we're going to need to add a constructor that will allow us to pass in the object that we actually want this command to operate on. So what that's going to look like is we're going to have a counter object passed in. So we'll say counter of type counter. And then we'll add an instance variable here that will keep track of that. So we'll say private counter counter. And inside the constructor now, what we're going to do is we're going to say this.counter equals counter. Cool, so now that we've done that, what we're going to do now is in this execute method, all we need to do is say this.counter, and then we're going to say .setValue. And actually, one more thing that we're going to need to add to this counter class is a getValue property that will allow us to see what the current value is. So that's going to return a number, and we'll just say return this.value. And now that we've done that, let's go back to this. So we're going to set the value now to this.counter.getValue plus 1. Okay, and that is going to be what this increment command actually executes in our program, right? This increment command is actually going to increment the value of our counter by 1. And now, if we go down to this undo method in our increment command class, we're basically just going to have it do the opposite, right? So we'll say this.counter.setValue, this.counter.getValue minus 1. Okay, so in other words, we're defining what a command does, and we're defining how to undo that command inside this class, right? And if we wanted to make an increment by 5 command, let's say, then that would follow a very similar pattern to what we're doing here. It would just be value plus 5 and value minus 5 to actually implement that class. Cool, so now that we have our increment command and our counter command, let's create a simple example of this. What we're going to do is we're just going to create a new counter. So we'll say let counter equals new counter. And now we're going to create a new command here. So we'll say let inc command, and that's going to be a new increment command, of course. And what we're going to need to do is pass this counter as an argument to that constructor. So now, whenever we want to increment the counter, we just have to call inc command.execute, and that will automatically take care of everything else in the program for us related to incrementing that counter, right? So now, if we want to print that out, we'll just say console.log, and we'll say something like, in backticks here we'll put it, so that we can print out the counter value. We'll say the current value of counter is, and then we'll say counter.getValue, right? We can just say inc command.execute a few times, one after the other, and now we'll print out the same thing, right? So we'll say console.log underneath that, and then we can call inc command.undo, right? So we can say inc command.undo, and what that'll do is it will undo the last inc command that happened. So if we copy that and then we paste that here, we should see that that goes backwards. So now if we compile this command.ts file, we're just going to say tsc, and we can run that compiled file now with node build/command.js. We'll see that sure enough, the current value of the counter is 1 after calling increment command.execute once. Then after we call it 3 more times, its current value is 4. Then when we call undo, its current value is now 3. All right, so anyway, that's the basics of the command pattern. It really just gives us a way to represent the changes that take place in our program in a more concrete way. And as we've also seen, it allows us to do things like define how to undo a specific command if we wanted to add an undo feature to some program that we create. All right, so that's the command pattern, and that's the last pattern that we're going to talk about for now. So hopefully these different object-oriented design patterns that we've seen here are helpful for you, and I highly recommend that you look for different places to apply these patterns as you're developing any new piece of software. So anyway, let's go on to the next topic.